Let's talk about Ayn Rand. The two most surprising things about Ayn Rand's death of heart failure in 1982 is one, that she had a heart, and two, that we're still talking about her. UNFTR! In the event you're unfamiliar with Ayn Rand, and bless your heart if you're not, she was a mid-20th century novelist most famous for writing The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. The protagonists of her novels were fiercely independent, self-righteous dickheads whose perseverance and ingenuity rose above feckless bureaucrats and supposedly demonstrated the strength of American character. In her prime, this tiny little chain-smoking gnome had more than her allotted 15 minutes of fame by inspiring a generation of young people yearning to break the establishment bonds. A bunch of mediocre white dudes would punch above their weight for decades with tattered copies of Atlas Shrugged sticking out of their back pockets, decrying the establishment and following Rand as a cult-like head of a movement that she termed Objectivism. Instead of being relegated to the dustbin of history, Ayn Rand and her merry band of loser sycophants refused to shut up as they answer the question, who is John Galt?
For years you've asked, who is John Galt? You've asked that question in despair and resignation as factories closed, goods became scarce, jobs disappeared.
So who is John Galt? Well, the short answer to this question should be, who cares? Unfortunately, this question won't die, and neither will the philosophy that ultimately answers this insipid query. John Galt is the hero of Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, the last of her novels that gives the world the gift of objectivist theory. As with most of Rand's protagonists, who believe the individual is more important than society, if they were subjected to modern psychiatric analysis, they might be considered sociopaths. Rand was a Russian expat who had established herself as a vocal opponent of FDR. Her ideas were formed during the Depression, when she grew to loathe the president and what she deemed to be his socialist, anti-capitalist policies.
One of the principal achievements of this country in the past 20 years particularly, I think most people agree, is the gradual growth of social protective legislation based on the principle that we are our brother's keepers. How do you feel about the political trends of the United States, the Western world?
The way everybody feels, except more consciously. I feel that it is terrible, that you see destruction all around you, and that you are moving toward disaster until and unless all those welfare state conceptions have been reversed and rejected.
Over the next several decades, Rand's cult-like popularity would grow, and by the time she published Atlas Shrugged in 1957, she was a prominent national figure. Atlas Shrugged would become one of the best-selling American books of all time. Throughout her most prolific years, Objectivism was still more of a cultural phenomenon than a political one, though. But the 1970s, notes her biographer Ann Heller, quote, found Ayn Rand's ideas gliding quietly, almost anonymously, into the conservative mainstream. This was especially true among a new group of young right-wing libertarians who were disgusted with the economic policies of the Republican Party and determined to found a party of their own, end quote. Objectivism as a political ideology is impossibly rigid and absolute in a field that exists on the premise of compromise. But its popularity speaks to what Americans believe to be their mirror image: self-sufficient, uncompromising, and stoic. Yet Rand followers seem incapable of separating the woman and her philosophies from the fictional characters that she created. These characters were dropped into a world that fought against their scripted determination, a world where detractors ultimately succumbed to and broke against the protagonist's awesome powers of individualism. But to appreciate her novels requires the suspension of disbelief about the actual world we live in and realization that Rand herself wasn't as much of an individualist as she was an elitist. Objectivism is the Scientology of political theory, fantasy based upon fiction, the promulgation of which relies on the public's inability to understand the destructive potential of unregulated markets and unfettered capitalism. Who is John Galt? Like I said, who cares? We need to start asking the question, who are we? America is stuck in an identity crisis. The unmitigated assault on the middle class and working poor in this nation at some point must come to an end. Despite what Objectivism preaches, a properly functioning society requires a level playing field, and a level playing field requires a properly regulated and functioning system. It doesn't imply the redistribution of wealth, it attempts to establish an equitable access to it. The most notable modern politicians who admit to Rand as their North Star, people like former House Speaker Paul Ryan, former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan, resident Senate douche nozzle Ted Cruz, and the father-son libertarian stalwarts Ron and Rand Paul, all bowed down to this wee Russian troll. Alan Greenspan even laid a 6-foot-high floral wreath in the form of a $sign at her funeral because it was the Randism logo. The libertarians, like the Paul family, are a little easier to understand because their philosophy runs parallel to Rand's individualistic beliefs. But that's also the problem with both of them. The best description of libertarianism I ever heard was from Chris Hedges, who called it sort of a pre-industrial philosophy. Works great in theory when there's 3 million people in a huge territory like the US and incentives to forge westward and legally murder indigenous people in the spirit of frontierism, but it's a little less practical when there are 350 million of us burning through resources and destroying the planet. 350 million people with their own idea of what's right and lawful within a complicated and interdependent economic and social system, and most of them armed to the teeth, would amount to a year-round purge-like society. It's more the modern right-wing politicians that I have a problem with, though, particularly because they never grapple with the other side of Ayn Rand, the devout atheist. She saw all religions as silly, indulgent, and dangerous. So it's even more curious how the right-wing Christian fundamentalist wing of the Republican Party prays at the altar of Ayn Rand. In the end, Rand would distance herself from nearly everyone she ever cared for, and indeed those who had cared for her. Hers was an impossible personal standard, and the men in her life would prove a constant source of disappointment, each one failing to live up to her standards. Even her beloved husband, Frank O'Connor, once an inspiration for Rand's most adored characters, would eventually break down both physically and emotionally under the weight of such expectations. The only men who would never fail her lived on the pages of her novels. Ironically, she would finish her time on Earth as a recipient of Social Security, a program that she regarded as the epitome of the collectivist society that she denounced. But Rand was no hypocrite. She dutifully paid into it, and therefore she reluctantly took what was rightfully hers. So no, Ayn Rand wasn't a hypocrite. She was just wrong, and she would die very much alone, having alienated virtually everyone around her who failed to live up to her unreachable demands, a lesson lost on the legion of followers who continued to devour her words to this day. So while it might seem strange to devote an entire episode to Ayn Rand, the fact is that even those who haven't heard of her or read any of her novels, but who support the idea of rugged individualism, that all government is evil, the healthcare for all is socialism, are all influenced by the concepts of this tiny little Russian fame-seeking ashtray who took government support and wrote crappy novels in the 50s. She promoted a lack of faith in institutions to do good, the distrust of social programs or even society in general, that we need each other to thrive. And yet we're falling apart because half of this country has fallen for the myth of objectivism, whether they know to call it that or not. The concept carries powerful imagery of individual pursuit, but that only works in individual sports. Running a nation is a team sport. It's not okay to run off and steal somebody's land and violate their goats and piss on their boots, but Ayn Rand would say that's perfectly logical if that's what's in your heart. We live in a society, and it can be great if we can just get over ourselves and realize that our actions have an impact on others around us. Can government go too far? Of course. We should always be mindful of our individual liberties, which are too often taken for granted, or if you're a marginalized citizen, perhaps never even granted to you at all. The point is, there's a balance. But if you're unhappy with the way things are, the answers that you seek aren't in the pages of Atlas Shrugged. They're in the Bill of Rights, and maybe on Bernie Sanders' website. Here endeth the lesson.